Good evening, and welcome to Quiet Victorian Nights. Before tonight's story begins, allow yourself to settle comfortably. Let the bed carry your weight, soften your shoulders, and release whatever remains unfinished from the day. There is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing more you need to do tonight. You do not need to remember every name or follow every path. Let the words drift quietly around you, like snow settling upon a sleeping village. If sleep arrives before the story ends, you may simply allow it to come. And now, while autumn has not yet entirely left the hills, an early snow is beginning to cover the roofs and roads of Thornfold. Behind the window of a small post office, a lamp is being lit. A kettle is beginning to warm, and someone is still waiting for the sound of wheels. In the final days of October, Martha Vale opened the Thornfold post office at 6 o'clock each morning. She wound the brass clock above the sorting shelves, lifted the damper on the little coal stove, wiped the balance scale, and placed the empty outward mailbag upon the counter before the first customer arrived. On the morning the snow came early, it was the silence that woke her. Martha lay for a moment in the narrow bedroom behind the post office, listening for the sounds by which she usually measured the hour. There should have been the scrape of Samuel Pike opening the forge, the rattle of Arthur Bell's shutters, and the distant voices of children walking towards the school. Before long, the mail cart would sound on the road from the valley, its wheels striking the stones beneath her window. None of those sounds came. She rose, drew on her woolen wrapper, and moved to the window. Frost had been expected, but not this. Snow covered the sill in a smooth white ridge. Beyond it, Thornfold had almost disappeared beneath the weather. The village stood along a fold in the Yorkshire hills, its grey cottages gathered on either side of one steep road. That road passed the post office, the butcher's shop, and the school, before bending beside the church and descending towards the valley. Now its walls, ruts, and edges had vanished beneath a single pale surface. Snow rested upon slate roofs and low stone walls. It filled the gaps between the cobbles and softened the churchyard steps. Martha dressed and entered the public room. She followed her routine because routine required no decision. The clock was wound. The stove was lit. The counter was dusted, though no dust had settled overnight. She checked the scale with its brass weights and opened the ledger to a clean page. At 7:15, she hung the outward mailbag from its hook beside the door. At 7, she unlocked the post office. Cold air entered around her ankles. No footprints marked the snow outside. Martha swept the doorstep, cleared a narrow space beneath the letter slot, and returned behind the counter. The mail cart was usually visible shortly before 7:30. It came from the railway town below, carrying letters, newspapers, small parcels, and occasionally medicine wrapped in brown paper. Its driver rang a small bell before the final bend so that Martha would have the outward bag ready. 7:30 passed without a bell. Martha adjusted the position of the empty bag. At 8:30, she opened the door and looked down the road. The snow had thickened. Where the lane descended beyond the church, wind had driven it against the wall until the road and hillside appeared joined. No horse could safely have found the buried edge. Across from the post office, Arthur Bell emerged from his shop carrying a wooden shovel. He cleared the snow from his doorstep, in deliberate strokes, paused to look towards the valley, and then continued along the front of the building. Lucy appeared behind the window, wiped a circle in the misted glass, and pressed her face to it. Farther up the village, Miss Eliza Hart stood outside the school. She had opened the door and lit the classroom stove, but no children approached from the outlying cottages. After waiting several minutes, she swept a path to the gate and went back inside alone. Near the church, Reverend Edwin Shaw moved slowly between the graveyard wall and a small cottage occupied by an elderly widow. He carried a basket beneath his coat. The path he left behind him was the first dark line Martha could see crossing the snow. These were people whose names she had written thousands of times. She knew which shelf held their letters and how many pennies their parcels usually cost. Yet, from behind the post office window, each seemed to inhabit a separate island of stone, smoke, and white ground. Shortly after 9, a figure appeared at the far end of the lane. Samuel Pike walked from the direction of the forge, leaning slightly into the snow. His dark coat and leather apron made him easy to follow against the white road. Each step sank above his ankles. He carried no parcel and wore no hat, only a woolen scarf wrapped around his head. Martha opened the door before he reached it. Snow fell from his boots onto the floorboards as he entered. "The cart has not come," she said. Samuel removed one glove and held his hand towards the stove. "It will not." He had walked far enough down the hill to inspect the bend below the church. Wind had filled the cutting during the night. In some places, the snow stood nearly level with the wall. Until men cleared it, or the weather softened, the road was gone. Martha looked at the clock. The cart was more than 2 hours late, but Samuel's words made lateness seem irrelevant. A late cart could still be expected. A vanished road could not. "How long?" she asked. Samuel glanced towards the window, where fresh flakes were already covering the path he had made from the forge. "That depends upon what comes next." He stayed only long enough to warm his hands. The forge needed checking, and the roofs of 2 sheds had gathered more snow than he trusted. Before leaving, he advised Martha to keep the outer door closed whenever possible. His footprints created a clear line from the post office towards the forge. As snow continued, their edges softened, but the path remained visible because Samuel used it again before midday, this time carrying an iron shovel for Martha's step. No letters arrived. No newspapers reached the sorting table. The inward shelves remained empty, and the brass scale stood unused. Martha nevertheless remained behind the counter. She entered the missed cart in her ledger, tied the outward mailbag though it held only 3 envelopes, and listened whenever the wind changed, mistaking its movement around the eaves for distant wheels. By noon, the village had begun to make its own sounds. Shovels scraped against stone. Doors opened and closed. Someone called across the lane. Arthur cleared a path from his shop to the nearest cottage, and Reverend Shaw extended his tracks towards the school. In the afternoon, the snow became finer. Martha could see more of the village, though the road below the church remained lost. Eliza Hart arrived shortly before closing. Her boots were wet, and a scattering of snow had caught in the wool of her hat. She carried a cream envelope addressed to her sister in Leeds. "Will it go tomorrow?" Eliza asked. Martha looked at the envelope, then towards the road. "If the cart comes." Eliza placed the letter on the counter. It was the first item Martha had accepted since opening that morning. She checked the address and set it beside the outward bag. After Eliza left, Martha closed the post office and returned the bag to its hook. She did not place the letter inside. The damp air might reach it there, and there was no reason to seal the bag until a journey was possible. Instead, she laid the envelope in the center of the sorting table. Outside, evening gathered over Thornfold. Lamps appeared behind cottage windows, each small square of light surrounded by snow. The forge remained dark, the school door was closed, and the road descending into the valley could no longer be distinguished from the hillside. Martha stood alone beside the silent clock and listened as fresh snow touched the glass. For the first time in all her years at the post office, a letter had nowhere to go. Eliza Hart's cream envelope remained in the center of the sorting table throughout the night. When Martha entered the public room the following morning, it was the first thing she saw. Ordinarily, an accepted letter stayed in Thornfold for no more than a few hours. It passed from the counter to the outward bag, from the bag to the mail cart, and from the cart to the railway town below. By the next morning, the shelf was empty and Martha's attention had moved to whatever arrived in its place. Now the envelope appeared almost personal, merely because it had remained. Martha lit the stove, wound the clock, and examined the road. Samuel's path from the forge had survived as a shallow groove, although fresh snow had softened every footprint within it. The cutting below the church was still blocked. No bell sounded from the valley. She opened the post office at the usual hour and placed Eliza's letter beside the empty outward bag. The first customer was Mrs. Alden, who lived in a cottage near the upper well. She carried a letter addressed to her son in Manchester. The envelope had been folded from thick writing paper, and the address leaned downwards because her hand had begun too high. Martha checked the postage and placed it beside Eliza's. "It may not leave today," she explained. Mrs. Alden nodded. "It will be nearer to leaving here than on my mantel." Before 9, 3 more letters had arrived. One was a tradesman's account, one a birthday card, and one a reused envelope whose former address had been covered by a carefully pasted strip of paper. Martha accepted each item, though she could offer no departure time. She found a shallow drawer beneath the sorting table and removed the unused forms stored inside it. On a square of white card, she wrote, "Waiting for road." The letters lay together beneath the label, arranged by destination, as though the next stage of their journey might begin at any moment. Martha had always considered an envelope by its practical qualities. It possessed a weight, an address, a destination, and a required payment. Yet as the drawer filled, she began noticing other evidence left by the people who had prepared them. Mrs. Alden's flap had been sealed twice, suggesting that she had reopened the letter to add something. The birthday card bore a faint, greasy mark from the kitchen table upon which it had been written. One address had been corrected 3 times, each version smaller than the last. None of these details revealed the contents, but they made the envelopes less alike. Late in the morning, Lucy Bell entered wearing a red scarf and boots dusted white to their tops. Arthur had cleared a path across the road, yet the child had still stepped into deeper snow beside the post office wall. She placed a small blue envelope on the counter. Gold stars had been drawn around the address, and one corner was occupied by a crooked moon. "It is for my cousin," she said. "She has never seen snow before November." Martha checked the stamp. "It may be some time before she hears about it." Lucy considered this. The snow will still have happened. Its stars were visible whenever Martha opened the drawer. Eliza returned shortly after midday. She had spent the morning waiting at the school, but only 4 children from the center of Thornfold had arrived. Those living beyond the upper field could not safely reach the village, and their parents had sent word along the footpaths. She asked whether Martha expected the road to open soon. "Samuel says it depends upon what comes next." Both women looked through the window. The snowfall had weakened, but the clouds remained low over the hills. Eliza's path back to the school crossed the one Arthur had cleared from his shop, producing the first dark intersection in the snow. In the afternoon, Arthur entered with a large brown envelope addressed to a supplier in the railway town. It contained an account and an order for goods that ordinarily arrived with the weekly carrier. "We have enough for several days," he said, before Martha asked. "Longer, if people buy sensibly." His words sounded reassuring, but while Martha checked the address, Arthur turned twice towards the window. The buried road could not be seen from the counter, yet he looked in its direction, as though measuring the distance between his cellar and the supplies below. Martha placed his order in the waiting drawer. The brown envelope nearly covered Lucy's stars. Reverend Shaw came before closing. Snow clung to the hem of his coat, and the basket he had carried the previous day was now empty. He brought a letter for a chemist, requesting medicine for the elderly widow near the church. "She has enough for a fortnight," he said. "I had hoped to order before it became necessary." Martha examined the postage, then hesitated with the letter in her hand. A fortnight sounded generous compared with one blocked day, but the drawer had already begun to alter her sense of time. Every envelope within it depended upon the same road. She placed the chemist's letter on top, where it would be easy to find when the mail cart returned. At the end of the day, Martha counted 19 waiting letters. She did not open any of them. She did not need to. Their addresses alone drew a map beyond Thornfold. Leeds, Manchester, York, Sheffield, and villages whose names she knew only from postal guides. For years, her work had carried the concerns of Thornfold outwards and brought answers back. Now that movement had stopped. The village could still speak, but none of its words could travel farther than the drawer beneath her hands. She closed it carefully and turned the card so its lettering faced the room. Samuel arrived as she was preparing to lock the door. He brought no letter. His boots left damp marks upon the floor, and his coat smelled faintly of smoke from the forge. He had spent the afternoon checking sheds and helping clear the path near the church. Several households, he said, had delayed buying their winter coal because the cold had arrived before they expected it. "You know every house," Samuel said. "Do you know which ones have not taken a delivery?" Martha's first impulse was to say that coal was not a postal matter. Then she remembered Mrs. Alden's unsteady writing, Arthur's glance towards the road, the chemist's letter resting above Lucy's stars, and Eliza waiting in an empty classroom. She took a sheet intended for recording parcels and drew a line down its center. At the top, in the same careful hand she used for addresses, Martha wrote, "Coal remaining. I shall bring this to the forge in the morning," she said. After he left, Martha placed the new list on top of the closed drawer. Outside, the paths between the post office, forge, school, church, and butcher's shop had begun to cross. The road out of Thornfold remained buried, but within the village, other routes were slowly appearing. The following morning, Martha folded the sheet marked "Coal remaining" into quarters and placed it inside her coat. The waiting letters stayed in their drawer beneath the sorting table. Before leaving the post office, she added fuel to the stove, locked the public door, and hung a notice saying that she would return within the hour. Samuel's path to the forge had been widened by repeated use. Martha followed it between low walls capped with snow. The cold had hardened the surface overnight, and her boots broke through the thin crust with each step. The forge stood at the lower end of Thornfold, where the village road began its descent towards the church. Its chimney released a dark, steady thread into the pale morning. Inside, the air changed at once. Heat pressed against Martha's face, carrying the smells of coal, iron, damp leather, and wood smoke. Samuel was repairing the blade of a snow shovel. The handle had been removed, and the metal lay across the anvil while he examined a split near one edge. He set down his hammer when Martha unfolded the paper. Behind the forge stood the largest coal store in Thornfold. It was not large by the measure of a railway yard or factory, but beside the small household bins of the village, it seemed substantial. Coal was stacked beneath a lean-to roof, black surfaces catching faint points of light where melting frost touched them. Martha began estimating how many households could be supplied. Samuel stopped her before she had filled the first column. "The forge must remain working," he said. He pointed to the shovel on the anvil. Snow placed different demands upon the village. Handles broke, gate hinges stiffened, latches failed when wood contracted in the cold. Horses still required shoes, and farm tools could not be abandoned merely because the road was closed. If they divided the coal too quickly, Thornfold might gain several warm evenings and lose the only place capable of repairing what kept the paths open. Martha crossed out her first calculation. She had regarded the store as a quantity to be distributed. Samuel regarded it as fuel attached to particular kinds of work. They began again. Samuel estimated what the forge would consume if he allowed the fire to fall low whenever no repair was waiting. Martha recorded that amount in the first column. A second portion was reserved for the school and the church hall, should either be needed as a shared warm room. Everything remaining would be considered for households in immediate need. The difficulty lay in knowing which households those were. Martha knew who had received coal bills through the post and which families regularly paid merchants in the valley, but a bill did not reveal how much remained in a cellar, and the absence of a bill did not prove an empty bin. Reverend Shaw arrived while they were discussing this. He carried a folded page taken from the back of an old church register. On it were the names of people he had visited since the snow began. The elderly widow near the church had enough coal for only a few more days. Mrs. Alden, near the upper well, possessed a small store, but could not easily carry it from her shed. 2 cottages beyond the school held young children. A farm labourer recovering from illness required more warmth than usual. Another household had fuel, but no dry kindling. Samuel knew which houses could safely burn larger coal, and which possessed only narrow grates. Martha knew the shortest routes between them. Reverend Shaw knew who might claim to be comfortable rather than trouble a neighbor. Their separate knowledge became useful only when placed together. Martha ruled the paper into new columns: household, people, coal remaining, grate, assistance required. She wrote the names in the order of need rather than alphabetically. This felt strange after years of sorting every person by surname, yet an alphabetical list would not tell Samuel where to carry the first basket. They agreed that no house would receive a large delivery at once. Small quantities would be taken where needed, and the list would be checked again after 2 days. This preserved the store while ensuring no one reached an empty grate unnoticed. Martha recognized in the arrangement something familiar. A letter could not reach every destination by the same route, and neither could a sack of coal. Weight, distance, weather, and the person waiting at the far end all mattered. The difference was that she had never before walked beside the thing being delivered or seen the room that would receive it. Samuel filled the first coal sack for the widow near the church. Martha weighed it upon the forge scale and entered the amount. When Samuel lifted it onto his shoulder, she gathered the register page and followed him outside. The route passed the post office, then curved towards the churchyard wall. Reverend Shaw walked ahead to clear the narrowest section. The three of them left a broad track where yesterday there had been only separate footprints. At the cottage, Martha waited beside the gate while Samuel carried the sack to the coal bin. Through the open door, she saw a small fire, a kettle, and an armchair drawn close to the grate. Nothing suggested immediate danger. That was precisely the reason the visit felt sensible. Help had arrived before the room became cold. On their return, they stopped at Mrs. Alden's shed and moved part of her own coal nearer the kitchen door. No fuel had to be given, only made reachable. Martha added a note to the final column. By midday, the list contained 9 households. Some required coal, others needed kindling, carrying, or a repaired grate. The work was smaller and more varied than Martha had imagined when she first wrote the heading. She returned to the post office and opened the public door. No mail cart had arrived. 3 more letters were waiting in the slot, their edges cold from the metal flap. Martha placed them in the drawer, then set the coal sheet beside her postal ledger rather than returning it to her pocket. The 2 records looked unrelated. One followed messages beyond Thornfold, the other followed heat moving between its houses. Yet both depended upon names, destinations, and someone remembering what had not yet arrived. During the afternoon, Samuel came twice to report deliveries. Martha marked each one with a small stroke. Reverend Shaw added the name of a family whose kindling had become damp. Arthur Bell offered an empty handcart for carrying the next sacks. Shortly before closing, Eliza entered, carrying an iron latch wrapped in cloth. The school door would no longer fasten properly. Cold had tightened the wood around it, and forcing the handle had bent the metal. Samuel said I should bring it here if he was out, she explained. Martha looked at the coal ledger, then at the latch. Samuel was delivering fuel near the upper well. She closed the post office 10 minutes early and walked with Eliza to the forge. Samuel returned as they arrived. He examined the latch, reheated the forge, and straightened the bent section with 3 measured blows. While the metal cooled, Eliza spoke of the school. Only 3 pupils had reached it that morning. The room had been warmed, the books opened, and the lesson prepared, but most desks remained empty. Samuel fitted the latch into Eliza's cloth. Martha gathered the coal sheet and offered to carry the repaired piece back. They followed the path uphill together. When Eliza opened the school door, heat from the bank stove met them, along with the dry smells of chalk, slate, and wooden desks. Every bench was empty. The warmth that met Martha at the school door seemed too generous for a room without children. It rested upon the rows of small desks, softened the rectangles on the blackboard, and drew a faint resinous scent from the old floorboards. Near the stove, a kettle made a sound beneath its lid. Nothing else moved. Eliza remained on the threshold, holding the repaired latch in both hands. Then she crossed to the teacher's desk and set it down beside the attendance book. Martha removed her gloves. Together, they fitted the iron piece into its former place. Samuel had straightened the bent tongue and polished away the rough edge, so that when Eliza closed the door, it settled into the frame with a quiet click. "At least the weather will stay outside now," Martha said. Eliza looked at the empty benches. "So will most of my pupils." There was no bitterness in her voice, only the tired acceptance of someone who had waited through several mornings and had heard no boots in the passage. The children living nearest the green might still have come, but Eliza would not continue lessons for 3, while the others were separated by fields, drifts, and walls of snow. She opened the attendance book, drew one careful line beneath the final names, and closed it again. The school, as a school, would remain shut until the outer paths were safe. Yet Eliza did not put out the stove. Instead, she took a wicker basket from the cupboard and began filling it with primers, 2 storybooks, chalk, slate pencils, and a bundle of copy sheets. Martha watched her consider a geography book before returning it to the shelf. There was little use teaching rivers and counties to children whose present world had narrowed to the nearest cottage. "If they cannot come here," Eliza said, "I can take a little of the school to them." On the back of an old notice, Martha drew the village as she knew it from years of sorting letters: the green, the church, the upper well, the row beyond the forge, and the scattered houses past the school. Eliza supplied the pupils' names. Reverend Shaw, when he arrived to see whether the latch had been mended, added 3 homes where a brief visit would be welcome, even though no pupil lived there. They arranged the route in short circles, each beginning and ending at the school. Martha could not leave the post office for long during its open hours, but she promised to join Eliza after closing, and on the quieter afternoon, when no collection could possibly be expected. Lucy Bell appeared the following day, carrying a cloth bag, and asking whether books were heavier than potatoes. Eliza answered that it depended upon the book. Lucy accepted this seriously and placed 2 primers in her bag. Their first path ran past the church to the cottage of Mrs. Wren, who listened while Eliza read a page about a shepherd and his dog. Martha noticed that the fire had fallen to a low red glow. and that the coal scuttle held only dust and 3 small pieces. Mrs. Wren insisted she was comfortable. Martha did not argue. She merely wrote the address inside her pocket notebook, beside the mark that meant Samuel should call. At the next house, 2 children copied sentences at a scrubbed kitchen table while their mother mended a sleeve. A lamp stood ready for evening, but when the woman lifted it, the oil shifted scarcely above the base. Martha made another small mark, this one for Arthur, who kept several tins beneath the counter. Beyond the upper well, they found a boy wearing 1 dry glove and 1 damp one. His second pair hung stiffly beside the range, washed but not yet warmed through. Lucy removed the knitted mittens from her own pocket. She said she had another pair at home, though Martha knew this was unlikely. Eliza suggested that the school stove might dry every child's gloves at once. The boy's mother looked relieved by the usefulness of the invitation. The last visit of the afternoon was to Mr. Crowther, who lived alone behind a clipped yew hedge. He had no child to teach and required neither coal nor lamp oil. Still, he asked Eliza to read both chapters of the storybook. When she finished, he spoke for nearly 20 minutes about the sheep he had tended when he was young. On the way back, Lucy said he must have been saving the words because no one had called to collect them. Snow began to sift down, thin as flour, covering the edges of their earlier prints, yet the center of the path remained firm beneath their feet. Over the next 2 days, the basket traveled through Thornfold. Lessons were given beside washtubs, hearths, and narrow beds. Sometimes Martha accompanied Eliza. Sometimes she remained behind the post office counter and heard the account afterward, as each need was transferred to the proper page: coal, oil, clothing, food, or company. Every circuit revealed something that a formal question might have missed. A child reciting sums could mention that the bedroom window would not close. A mother finding a pencil might confess that her candles were nearly gone. A lonely neighbor, invited to listen to a story, could accept companionship without having to ask for it. On the 3rd afternoon, as they returned with an empty basket, Lucy stopped at the school gate. From there, several tracks could be seen crossing the white village. One curved toward the church, another past the upper well. A third descended toward Arthur's shop before dividing between the cottages. "The school has roads now," she said. Martha followed the child's gaze. The tracks were modest and irregular, no wider than 2 pairs of boots in places, but each one joined a door to another door. Before the snowfall, those connections had been too ordinary to notice. Eliza looked from the paths to the warm windows of the classroom. The next morning, she reopened the building, though not for lessons. Desks were moved aside. A drying rail was placed near the stove, and the kettle was filled. Anyone who wished to warm wet gloves, read quietly, share tea, or sit in company could enter. Martha lettered the notice in broad black strokes: firelit, all welcome. She fixed one copy to the school gate and carried another back to the post office. There she made 2 more, using the counter where undelivered letters waited in their drawer. When she pinned the final sheet inside the window, Arthur Bell entered with his brown supplier's envelope still in his hand. He read the notice, then looked at Martha. "How many are using the school stove?" he asked. Martha told him the number she knew, adding the households Eliza meant to visit next. Arthur nodded slowly. His eyes did not return to the road, or to the letter that could not leave. Instead, he looked toward the shelves of his shop across the green. "And how many of them," he asked, "will need something warm to eat?" Arthur's question remained between them, while the post office clock measured 3 quiet seconds. Martha looked past him, through the window, toward the school. Smoke rose from its chimney in a narrow grey line. During the afternoon, she had counted 11 people going through the gate, though several had returned home before others arrived. Eliza expected 2 more families on the following day, and Mrs. Wren might be brought down if the path near the church could be widened. "Perhaps 16, Martha said, "not all at once." Arthur folded the unsent supplier's order and slipped it into his coat. 16 people can be warmed by 1 stove. They cannot all be fed by 1 kettle. He asked Martha to come across the green when she closed the post office. An hour later, Martha turned the sign in her window and followed the path to the butcher's shop. The bell above Arthur's door gave a muted ring. Inside, the usual clean scents of salt, sawdust, and cold stone met her. Lucy was seated behind the counter, copying a passage from one of Eliza's primers while wearing only 1 pair of mittens. Arthur lifted a lamp from its hook. The cellar stairs were behind a narrow door at the back of the shop. The cellar was cool and orderly. Shelves ran along 2 walls, their contents separated by type and age. There were joints of salted meat wrapped in cloth, 2 stone jars of dripping, a crock of lard, strings of onions, a shallow crate of potatoes, and several sacks whose folded corners bore chalk marks. "There is more than an empty shop window suggests," Martha said. "And less than a full cellar suggests," Arthur replied. He showed her what had to be used soon and what might keep for weeks. 1 piece of beef would not last until the road opened. The onions were sound, but some potatoes had begun to soften. The oatmeal would make many breakfasts if measured carefully. Salt meat could wait. Flour was the uncertainty. Arthur had ordered 2 sacks before the snow, and both remained somewhere beyond the valley. Martha took out the notebook she had used on Eliza's rounds. On a fresh page, she wrote each item and its quantity. Arthur weighed what could not be counted. When they had finished, the list was useful, but incomplete. It described only what 1 shop possessed, not what Thornfold had. "Mrs. Alden keeps hens," Martha said. "The Westons have the 2 milk cows. Reverend Shaw has dry goods at the rectory, and the Harpers bought flour before the first snow." Arthur glanced at her. "You know everyone's cupboards?" "No, I know which parcels they collect and which bills they send." It was the knowledge of a postmistress, indirect, ordinary, gathered without intention. Martha knew who ordered tea by the pound, who received seed catalogues, who sent payment to the miller, and which households had grown since the previous winter. Yet she also knew that such clues were not permission to decide what anyone should surrender. The following morning, she placed a clean sheet beside the notice in the post office window. It did not ask what people lacked. Instead, it asked what they could spare without hardship. Mrs. Alden could offer 6 eggs every second day if someone collected them. The Westons had milk, though the upper path would need clearing before a pail could be carried safely. One cottage had half a sack of barley meal, another had dried peas. The rectory held tea, sugar, rice, and 3 tins of cocoa intended for the parish Christmas gathering. Mrs. Harper possessed flour, but less than Martha had supposed, for 2 nieces were staying with her until the road returned. Martha recorded every contribution and every household beside it. She made separate marks for goods that must be used first, goods suitable for children, and provisions requiring long cooking. Beside the names of larger families, she noted the number of mouths without writing anything that resembled judgment. Arthur came and went between his shop and the post office, bringing weights and revised figures. At noon, he carried over a ruled ledger with a dark green cover. Its first pages had once been intended for accounts with traveling suppliers. Since no account could now travel beyond Thornfold, he drew new headings across them: household, number of persons, provisions received, provisions returned. He continued to write prices in a column. Martha saw him hesitate whenever he reached a household unable to pay immediately. Then, instead of a sum, he wrote one word: later. The word appeared beside Mrs. Wren, beside the labourer recovering beyond the school, and beside the family whose lamp oil had nearly gone. It was not a cancellation, and did not pretend to be charity. It simply moved the question of payment into a season when the road, the mail, and ordinary wages might move again. By late afternoon, the ledger had become a map made from food rather than paths. Eggs would travel down from Mrs. Alden. Milk would come from above the well. Onions and meat would cross the green. Rice and sugar would leave the rectory. Each item had a direction, a purpose, and someone responsible for carrying it. Martha read down the household column once more. Arthur had included the forge, the schoolroom, the cottages, and the rectory. He had not included the rooms above his own shop. "You and Lucy are missing," she said. Arthur continued sharpening his pencil. "We have the cellar. The cellar is on the giving page. It is all one cellar." Martha looked through the glass door. Lucy was crossing the green with Eliza's book bag, and the blue envelope still waiting for the road, tucked carefully beneath her arm. Her figure moved between paths made by other people's feet. Martha added Bell, 2 persons at the bottom of the page. Arthur watched her do it. He did not erase the entry, though his mouth tightened as if accepting the line required more effort than carrying a sack upstairs. The post office door opened before either of them spoke again. Reverend Shaw entered, bringing cold air and a folded message from the cottage near the church. Mrs. Wren's fire had burned lower than expected. Samuel had enough coal to carry her through the night, but not enough to keep every isolated hearth burning at its present rate for many more days. Martha placed the message beside the food ledger. The 2 records now told the same story in different measures. Coal could be saved if more people spent their days in the schoolroom. Food could be saved if one fire cooked for several households. The beef that would not keep, the softening potatoes, the onions, and a portion of barley could become more together than they were apart. Arthur descended to the cellar once more. When he returned, he carried the joint that had to be used first and set it on the counter. Then he added 6 onions and a basket of potatoes. "A stew," he said. "1 large pot, kept low and slow, enough for tomorrow, perhaps the day after." Reverend Shaw offered the church cooking pot. Martha assigned the collection of milk and eggs to 2 people whose paths were already clear. Arthur wrote, later, beside 3 more names, then, after a pause, beside his own. By the time Martha locked the post office, evening had turned the snow blue at the edges. She carried Reverend Shaw's message, the first meal list, and the notice of what each household would contribute along the path to the school. Through its lighted window, she saw Eliza pushing one pupil's desk away from the stove. Martha entered and laid the papers upon the teacher's table. Eliza read them, glanced around the room, and understood what space would be needed. Without calling it supper, relief, or any other grand name, the 2 women took hold of the nearest school table. Slowly, over the worn boards, they drew it toward a second one. The legs of the first table whispered across the schoolroom floor. Martha and Eliza moved it a few inches at a time until its edge met the second, leaving a narrow seam between the 2 worn surfaces. By the time they finished, the room no longer resembled a classroom awaiting absent pupils. It resembled a place prepared for whoever could reach it. Eliza found a folded linen cloth in the cupboard. It was too short to cover both tables, but Martha laid it across the join so that the uneven boards would not catch anyone's sleeve. Martha returned to the post office, carrying the list of contributions. She copied it into the green ledger and set small marks beside each item as it arrived. The eggs came first, wrapped in wool inside a basket. A boy from the upper well brought milk in a lidded pail, walking carefully where the path descended. The dried peas arrived in a flour sack no larger than a pillowcase. Reverend Shaw delivered bread, bowls, and the great black cooking pot from the church kitchen. Arthur collected them shortly after noon. He carried the meat and onions himself, while Lucy made 2 journeys with potatoes in her apron. People came in during the afternoon, not to send letters, but to ask whether something more was required. One woman offered salt, another could spare thyme dried above her range. Mr. Crowther sent 2 turnips and a message that he intended to come if the snow allowed. Martha added each offering to the ledger, although Arthur had said there was already enough. It seemed important that people should see their contribution recorded, however small. Near 3 o'clock, Samuel appeared with Mrs. Wren beside him. The old woman leaned upon his arm, wrapped in a shawl and wearing a bonnet whose ribbons had been tied twice beneath her chin. Samuel had cleared the church path wider and pressed steps into the steepest part. He carried a coal scuttle in his free hand. For the school stove, he explained. Mrs. Wren protested that she could have remained beside her own fire, yet she entered the post office to rest halfway, and Martha saw color return to her cheeks while the kettle boiled. When they continued toward the school, Mrs. Wren carried letters from the waiting drawer in her pocket, not because they could be delivered, but because she wished to hear Martha tell her who had written them. Martha watched the paths fill through the dusk. Figures appeared at separate doors and moved toward the same lighted windows. Lucy crossed the green several times. On her 4th journey, she paused outside Martha's window and counted upon her mittened fingers. 1 from the post office, she said when Martha opened the door. 1 from the forge, 1 from Father's shop, 1 from the church, and 3 from the cottages. 7 paths, Martha said. Lucy looked toward the school gate, where Boots had already pressed the separate tracks together. They all become one at the end. Then she hurried away with a bundle of spoons tucked beneath her arm. Martha closed the post office after the last person had crossed the green. She banked the fire, checked the locked drawer marked "Waiting for Road," and carried the green ledger with her. The snow made the school windows appear brighter than they were. Their glow lay across the path in 2 long rectangles, revealing prints of boots, clogs, and 1 narrow sledge. Inside, the room held the gentle disorder of many people occupying unfamiliar places. Damp gloves hung from the rail. Shawls rested across the backs of chairs. The smallest children sat upon benches, their feet unable to reach the floor. Steam clouded the lower window panes, and the air smelled of beef, onion, thyme, and bread warmed near the stove. Martha stopped just inside the door. Her first thought was to find an empty place near the pot and help Arthur serve. She had spent the day directing food from one person to another, and it seemed natural to continue moving rather than sit. Arthur was standing beside the cooking pot, with his sleeves folded above his wrists. Before Martha could offer assistance, he nodded toward the far end of the table. A bowl had been placed there for her. It was already filled, and a piece of bread rested across its rim. Beside it lay a spoon and an empty cup. Lucy had kept the chair free with one of Eliza's primers. Martha removed the book and sat down. No one called the gathering a supper. No grace was announced, although Reverend Shaw bowed his head briefly before lifting his spoon. The meal began with the quiet sounds of bowls being drawn closer and bread being broken by hand. The stew was simple and thick. The potatoes that had begun to soften were no longer distinguishable from the better ones. The meat Arthur had feared losing had flavored the whole pot. Each bowl held more warmth than any of its ingredients might have provided alone. Conversation moved slowly along the table. Martha learned that Mrs. Wren took tea without sugar, but cocoa with 2 spoonfuls. Mr. Crowther disliked turnips, despite having contributed them, and pushed every piece to the edge of his bowl. One of the Harper children always felt cold in her left foot before the right. Eliza knew 3 stories by heart and could tell them while serving bread. Samuel, whose hands appeared too broad for delicate tasks, could quiet a restless baby simply by allowing it to hold one of his fingers. None of these things would have appeared in a parish register or postal book. They were facts known only by sharing a table long enough for habits to reveal themselves. Arthur ate standing until Martha pointed to the place beside Lucy. He looked toward the pot as though it might require guarding, but Eliza took the ladle from him. At last he sat. When Reverend Shaw passed him a second piece of bread, Arthur accepted it without first asking whether everyone else had eaten. After the bowls were emptied, no one left immediately. The single school stove used less coal than the scattered fires that would otherwise have burned through the afternoon. Mrs. Wren warmed her hands around a cup. 2 children slept against their mother's sleeves. Mr. Crowther began his story about the winter when sheep had been brought into a kitchen, and although Lucy had heard it during Eliza's visit, she did not say so. Martha opened the green ledger only once. She recorded the number of bowls served and the coal remaining beside the stove. Then she closed it. For the rest of the evening, she allowed the figures to become people again. When the gathering finally thinned, Samuel stood at the school door and studied the sky. The clouds had lifted beyond the dark line of the hills, and several stars were visible above the church roof. "If it stays clear," he said, "the snow may settle firmly enough for us to work on the lower road tomorrow." Arthur mentioned the repaired shovels waiting at the forge. Reverend Shaw offered to find men for the first shift. Their voices remained low, but hope passed around the room. Martha walked home along the path Lucy had counted. Behind her, the school windows dimmed as lamps were extinguished one by one. The next morning, she opened the post office shutters to a windless sky. Samuel was crossing the green with a shovel upon his shoulder. Behind him came Arthur, Reverend Shaw, and 3 others, each carrying another tool newly straightened at the forge. They passed Martha's window and followed the buried road down toward the valley. The men passed Martha's window in single file, their shovels resting upon their shoulders and their boots falling into Samuel's prints. Beyond the final cottage, even those dark boundaries sank beneath the smooth white slope. Martha watched until the last figure disappeared around the bend. Then she turned the post office sign to open, set the kettle upon the hob, and took out a sheet of paper. Across the top, she wrote "Road Parties." Samuel had explained the arrangement before leaving. No one was to remain on the lower road until exhaustion made the return difficult. 6 people would work, 3 at either edge, and others would relieve them at midday. The snow removed from the center must be carried beyond the hedges rather than piled beside the track, where the next wind could return it. Martha ruled the page into 3 columns: name, time departed, time returned. The first message came with Arthur, who returned earlier than expected to open his shop. They had reached the ash tree below the last cottage. Samuel wanted another pair of gloves and a flask of tea sent down with the relief party. Martha wrote the location beside the first 6 names. She filled 2 stone bottles with hot tea, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them near the door. Eliza brought gloves from the school drying rail. By noon, the post office had become the place where the road entered and left the village without moving. Men returned with snow upon their caps and reported another yard, another gatepost, another stretch of hedge uncovered. Martha recorded every distance. She served tea, hung wet scarves near the fire, and placed cold gloves upon a wooden screen before lending out warm ones. Samuel had forbidden racing, both for safety and because hurried shoveling wasted strength. Each party remained long enough to clear a useful section, then yielded its tools to the next. Reverend Shaw, who had gone down with the second group, came back breathing heavily, but carrying himself with the satisfaction of a man who had uncovered 20 feet of road. Lucy drew a line upon a scrap of paper whenever a new report arrived. She began at the post office, passed Arthur's shop and the forge, then curved the pencil between 2 hedges. Her map was not measured, yet it lengthened through the afternoon as steadily as Martha's list. At the school, Eliza kept the stove burning for those who were resting. A pot of broth stood near the fire, made from what remained of the previous evening's stew. Men ate without removing all their outer clothing, then exchanged damp mittens for dry ones and returned to the road. Mrs. Wren sat beside the stove, pairing gloves by size. Martha crossed the green only once, when the post office was quiet enough to leave for several minutes. She carried the green food ledger and compared it with Eliza's count of bowls. There was enough broth for both road parties and those spending the day in the warm room. Coal, however, was being used faster because the door opened so often. In the middle of the afternoon, Samuel himself came back. Melted snow darkened the shoulders of his coat, and a fine whiteness clung to his beard. He stood near the stove until his breathing settled, refusing the chair Martha placed for him, but accepting tea. They had reached the stone bridge. The bridge was no great distance from Thornfold in fair weather. Under snow, however, it had seemed almost beyond the village's world. Hearing its name spoken aloud altered the room. Arthur, who had come for the latest report, looked toward the road. Lucy added a small arch to her map. Samuel warned that the drift beyond the bridge was deeper. The ground there turned across an open field before meeting the valley road, and the hedge was broken in 2 places. Still, if the sky remained clear and the night brought no wind, they might reach the old milepost by the following afternoon. The milepost stood where the Thornfold lane joined the road used by the mail cart. Once it was uncovered, there would be a chance of meeting anyone clearing upward from the valley. Martha did not move the letters from the waiting drawer, but she opened it and counted them. 23 envelopes now lay inside. Eliza's cream letter remained at the bottom. Lucy's blue one rested near the top, its crooked gold moon visible beneath a folded bill. For the first time since the snow began, Martha imagined fastening the bundle with string and placing it in the outgoing mailbag. Near dusk, the final party returned. Their faces were tired, yet their report was better than Martha had expected. They had cleared well beyond the bridge and exposed part of the low stone wall beside the open field. Samuel believed one more day might be sufficient. Arthur brought another pot to the school. Eliza counted the dry gloves. Reverend Shaw arranged the next morning's names, placing younger men beside older ones so that no pair would exhaust itself. Martha copied the shifts into her road book, then pinned the page beside the fire-lit notice. That evening, Thornfold appeared quieter than it had on the first night of isolation. The sky remained clear. Stars stood sharply above the roofs, and the packed paths shone beneath them. From her upstairs window, Martha could trace the route toward the lower road by the cuts left by shovels. She slept believing she might hear the mail cart within 2 days. Sometime after midnight, the wind returned. It did not wake Martha at once. The first sound entered her sleep as the brushing of a broom against a distant floor. Later came a faint tapping at the window, then a soft pressure in the chimney. When she rose and drew back the curtain, the stars had vanished. Snow moved through the darkness in thick, slanting sheets. The paths across the green were already fading. The separate tracks disappeared first, then the wider way to the school. Beyond the roofs, nothing showed where the men had cleared the road. Martha remained by the window for several minutes. There was no purpose in measuring what could not yet be seen. She returned to bed and listened while the village was covered once more. By morning, snow rested halfway up the lower panes of the post office. Martha cleared the doorstep, lit the fire, and opened the waiting drawer, as she always did. The letters were unchanged, though the hope attached to them felt quieter. Samuel arrived before she had finished sorting the counter. Snow lay across his shoulders, His shovel remained at the forge. He removed his cap and looked toward the drawer. "The road is gone again," he said. Martha nodded. Through the window, she could see 3 men who had worked below the bridge. Instead of turning downhill, they were clearing the path toward Mrs. Wren's cottage. Arthur was opening a way between his shop and the school. Reverend Shaw had begun at the church gate. The village had not stopped working. It had merely turned its tools inward. Martha closed the narrow road ledger. From the bottom shelf beneath the counter, she quietly took a larger book bound in plain brown cloth. It had been intended for the next year's postal accounts, and every page was empty. She opened it beneath the lamp and wrote across the first page, "Thornfold, winter." The bell above the door sounded. Eliza entered, carrying a scrap of paper dotted with melted snow. She placed it beside Martha's new heading. On it was the name of a family beyond the school and 2 words beneath it, "Needs blankets." Martha read the 2 words again, "Needs blankets." Eliza had written the family's name above them and added a small cross to indicate the cottage beyond the school. 3 children lived there with their parents. Their beds were dry, but the second snowfall had pressed powder through a gap beneath the eaves, and 2 blankets had been used to protect the bedding while the roof was cleared. Martha entered the need beneath the new heading in her brown ledger. Then she looked at the little scrap of paper. If it remained on the counter, only those who happened to stand nearby would know of it. If she placed it in a drawer, it would become one more message waiting for a road. She cleared a space upon the wall beside the post office window. An old wooden board had hung there for years, carrying railway times, postal charges, and notices about parcels too large for the mail cart. The railway sheet was useless, while no one could reach the station. Martha removed it, turned the board over, and covered the plain side with brown wrapping paper. At the top she wrote, "Thornfold notices." Beneath it, she fixed Eliza's message with 2 pins. On the left, she added, "Required, 2 blankets." On the right, she left a space for the name of whoever could provide them. The answer came before the ink had dried. Mrs. Harper, entering to ask after the road, read the notice and offered 1 wool blanket from her spare room. Reverend Shaw supplied the second from the church hall cupboard. Martha wrote both names beside the request and drew a line beneath it. Completed. The line gave her an unexpected satisfaction. A message had been received, directed, and answered without traveling farther than the village green. Before noon, more scraps appeared. Eliza brought the names of the homes she had visited and marked those where children were ill, cold, or simply unable to leave. Samuel reported a broken grate near the upper well and a door hinge weakened by frost. Arthur sent the quantities of oatmeal, onions, milk, and lamp oil remaining. Reverend Shaw added requests for a hot water bottle, 2 candles, and someone to sit with Mr. Crowther during the darker part of the afternoon. Martha did not fasten every message to the board. Some matters belonged in the ledger, where names could remain private. The public notices stated only what was needed, where it should be taken, and whether someone had accepted the task. She used blue pencil for food, black for fuel and repairs, and red for anything that ought to be dealt with before nightfall. The board began to change the rhythm of the post office. People entered, read from top to bottom, and considered what their own cupboards, hands, or hours might offer. One person came for lamp oil, and left carrying candles to another house. A boy collecting milk accepted a parcel of dry socks. A woman, who had no goods to spare, volunteered to spend an hour with Mr. Crowther and returned later with the empty hot water bottle tucked beneath her shawl. Each completed task received Martha's straight pencil line. Lucy arrived after midday and stood before the board with her head tilted. She had brought the map drawn during the road clearing, though the long line toward the stone bridge no longer represented a passable route. "May I put the houses on it?" she asked. Martha gave her a piece of chalk and the lower corner of the board. Lucy began with the post office, drawing it as a square with a very large door. The school received 4 windows and a curling thread of smoke. The church had a pointed roof. Arthur's shop was marked by a hanging sign, and the forge by a tiny horseshoe. From these buildings, she drew lines toward the cottages. Some curved around drifts. Others followed the walls where Samuel had cleared snow. At every place where one track joined another, Lucy thickened the chalk. Her map did not resemble any official plan Martha had seen. Distances expanded or contracted according to how difficult Lucy found the walk. Mrs. Wren's cottage appeared far from the church, while the school and butcher's shop nearly touched. Yet the drawing showed something measurements could not. It showed which doors could reach one another. Martha used the chalk lines when assigning deliveries. A person taking coal toward the upper well could carry candles to the neighboring cottage. Someone returning from the school could collect eggs from Mrs. Alden. No journey needed to serve only one purpose. During the afternoon, the bell above the post office door sounded so often that Martha ceased expecting letters. It announced reports instead. Samuel had repaired the grate. The Harper blanket had arrived. Mrs. Wren would remain at the school until evening. The Westons could spare another pail of milk if someone brought back the empty one. Arthur's lamp oil should be reserved for homes without candles. Martha listened, wrote, sorted, and sent each piece of news carefully onward. Only after closing the ledger to sharpen her pencil did she understand why the work felt familiar. Nothing essential about her occupation had changed. She was still receiving messages. She still determined where they belonged, chose the safest route, and checked whether they had reached their destination. The distances were different. Instead of Leeds, Manchester, or the Valley Station, a message might travel to the forge, the school, or the cottage behind the yew hedge. It might be written on the back of a grocery bill rather than sealed in an envelope. It might be carried by a child in mittens instead of a uniformed driver. But it was still the post. The thought made Martha glance toward the drawer marked "Waiting for Road." Those letters remained important because they carried words beyond Thornfold. The messages on the board mattered because they kept life moving within it. One did not replace the other. As the light faded, the brown paper filled with lines, names, and small amendments. Beside each request, another hand gradually appeared. Needed coal became Samuel. Afternoon. Milk became collected by Harper Boy. Company for Mr. Crowther became Mrs. Lane. Completed. The village seemed to be answering itself in many kinds of handwriting. Eliza came shortly before dusk, carrying the day's final note. The schoolroom would serve another stew the following afternoon. There were vegetables and enough oatmeal to thicken the pot. but Lucy wished to make bread from a recipe she had found at home. Arthur had not included flour among the next day's portions. Martha checked the food ledger. Mrs. Harper's supply had already been reduced for her nieces. The rectory had rice, but little flour. Arthur's cellar remained the only place where even a small quantity might be spared. She wrote a brief notice asking whether one full measure could be released for the school. Then she looked at the darkening windows across the green. Arthur had already closed the shop, and no light showed behind the counter. Lucy's chalk map offered another route. A line passed from the post office to the school gate, curved behind the butcher's shop, and ended at the side door leading to the Bell's kitchen. Martha pinned the other messages securely, put on her coat, and placed the flower notice inside her glove. After locking the post office, she followed the path Lucy had drawn. The path behind Arthur's shop was narrower than Lucy's chalk line had suggested. Snow leaned inward from both sides, brushing Martha's coat as she passed. At the end of it stood a door with a latch polished by years of use. She knocked and heard Lucy answer from within. The child opened the door, wearing a flour-dusted apron over her dress. Warmth moved into the passage, carrying the smells of coal smoke, milk, and something sweet. Martha removed the notice from her glove and explained that Eliza had asked whether Arthur could spare one measure of flour for the school. "Father is in the cellar," Lucy said. "He told me not to begin until he came back." On the kitchen table stood an empty mixing bowl, the household scales, and a round wooden sieve. Beside them lay an open book with a faded blue cover. Lucy had weighted the page with 2 spoons to prevent it from closing. Martha stepped inside and shut the door against the snow. The Bell's kitchen was smaller than the shop below and warmer in character. Copper pans reflected the fire. A checked cloth covered one end of the table. Near the window stood a wooden chair sized for an adult, with a child's chair placed close beside it. Only one part of the room seemed untouched by daily use. A narrow shelf hung above the dresser. Upon it were 2 china teacups with green rims, a row of spice tins, a small brown bottle, and a white crock painted with the word salt. A folded apron rested on one hook below. Its fabric had faded where sunlight reached it, but its strings remained neatly crossed, as though someone had arranged them that morning. Martha recognized the order of absence. Nothing was covered or packed away, yet nothing had been allowed to change. Lucy saw her looking. "Those were Mother's," she said. "Father says they are safe there." Martha turned her attention to the recipe book. She did not ask when Mrs. Bell had last worn the apron or which teacup she had preferred. The room had already given as much of an answer as it wished to give. The open page was headed milk tea bread. It required flour, warm milk, a little dripping, dried fruit and yeast. The writing beneath the title was small and slanted. Several words had faded where damp fingers had touched the paper. Lucy could read the ingredients, but not the shortened instructions. She had mistaken prove by hearth for place by heart, and could not understand why the dough required remembering. Martha smiled. "It means we let it rise near the fire." Lucy considered this and said that rising sounded nearly as difficult as remembering. Then she fetched the flour tin. There was not enough for the school and the recipe. Martha measured what remained with the scales, checked the amount written in the food ledger she carried, and divided it on paper. If Arthur released one full measure, there would be sufficient for a modest loaf at the school and a smaller tea bread in the Bell's kitchen. Neither would be large, but both could be shared. They waited for Arthur before opening the cellar sack. While they waited, Martha helped Lucy prepare everything else. They warmed milk at the edge of the range, softened the dripping, washed the dried fruit, and rubbed a little grease inside 2 tins. Lucy worked carefully, though flour still reached her sleeves, the table, and the end of her braid. The recipe gave no number for several quantities. It said, enough milk, a warm place, and flour until ready. Such instructions assumed the reader had once stood beside the writer and learned what enough and ready looked like. Martha knew postal measures, household accounts, and the weight of a letter by touch. Dough was less familiar. Together, she and Lucy added milk in spoonfuls until the mixture gathered from the bowl. It was not graceful work, but the dough slowly became smooth beneath their hands. Arthur returned, carrying a sack from the cellar. He stopped at the kitchen doorway. His gaze moved first to the flour on the table, then to the open book, and finally to the shelf above the dresser. Martha could not know which sight held him longest. She saw only that his hand tightened around the neck of the sack. Lucy began explaining at once. The school needed flour. The recipe needed less than she had thought. Martha had calculated both. Nothing had been taken from the cellar without permission. Arthur set the sack beside the scales. "Your mother used the blue tin," he said. It was the only correction he made. Lucy fetched a blue baking tin from the lowest cupboard. Arthur weighed the flour for the school, then another portion for the tea bread. When Martha reached for the sack, he allowed her to hold it while he tied the string. The gesture was ordinary, yet she understood that he was permitting another person to stand inside a task he had guarded alone. They placed the dough near the hearth to rise. Arthur did not move the teacups or the apron. He did, however, take the cinnamon tin from the shelf and hand it to Lucy. She added a small pinch, exactly as the faded note instructed. While they waited, Martha sat at the table and watched the fire settle. She had often believed that leaving people undisturbed was the purest form of respect. Behind the post office counter, she received letters without asking what they contained. She noticed sorrow and allowed it to pass without question. Privacy had seemed a kindness. Yet there were times when privacy became a closed door no one dared approach. Arthur had continued feeding the village because giving required no admission from him. To receive a bowl, a scarf, or help with a recipe was different. It suggested that he and Lucy were not merely managing their grief in a quiet room. They were still living inside it. Martha recognized something of herself in that caution. She had spent years carrying other people's messages while offering very little that might require an answer. The tea bread rose slowly. When Lucy pressed one finger into the surface, the hollow remained and the dough was ready. Arthur placed the tin in the oven. No solemn remembrance was spoken. The three of them simply waited while the room filled with cinnamon and warm fruit. The following afternoon, Arthur carried the finished tea bread to the school. Martha walked beside him with the flour intended for the larger loaf. Lucy went ahead, holding the blue recipe book beneath her coat. Eliza sliced the bread thinly so that everyone might taste it. Mrs. Wren said it reminded her of market days. Mr. Crowther ate the dried fruit first. Lucy watched each piece disappear without appearing disappointed that little remained for her. Reverend Shaw approached Arthur with a dark woolen scarf donated that morning. Arthur began to say that someone else might need it. Then his hand touched the bare collar of his coat. He looked toward Martha, accepted the scarf, and wound it once around his neck. Nothing in the room paused to mark the moment. Eliza continued cutting bread. The kettle continued its low murmur. Lucy opened her book beside the stove. Near the end of the meal, Samuel entered carrying the coal ledger. Grey dust marked his cuffs. He placed the book before Martha and opened it to the latest figures. The forge reserve was intact, but the coal allotted to the school and isolated cottages had fallen more quickly than expected. Another stretch of cold weather would leave too many small fires, consuming what remained. Martha carried the ledger back to the post office and set it beneath the community board. Above it, Lucy's chalk paths joined one house to another. Below them, the coal figures moved steadily toward zero. Before another night passed, Thornfold would have to decide which fires should continue burning. The coal ledger lay open beneath Lucy's chalk map. Martha stood before both for some time, moving her eyes between the figures below and the paths above. Every remaining hundredweight had already been assigned a purpose. The forge required enough to repair tools and fittings. The school stove warmed the largest room in Thornfold. The church hall possessed a smaller grate, but more floor space. Several cottages still needed fires, because their occupants could not safely cross the snow. If every household continued burning coal at its usual rate, the common supply would last only a few more days. Martha sent 3 messages. Samuel came from the forge, Arthur from his shop, and Reverend Shaw from the church hall. Eliza arrived soon afterward, having seen them enter the post office from the school window. Lucy followed with a piece of chalk in her mitten. They gathered around the counter without removing their coats. Their first task was to make what Thornfold possessed last until the sky changed. Samuel studied the coal figures and placed one blackened finger beside the forge reserve. "I can bank the forge," he said. "Keep only enough heat to prevent damage, then light it fully when a repair is needed. The coal saved would be divided between the school, the church hall, and the homes of those unable to move." Arthur proposed cooking at the school so that the same fire warmed the room, heated water, and prepared meals. Reverend Shaw offered the hall for sleeping, with its long benches pushed aside and mattresses brought from the rectory store. Martha opened the brown winter ledger to a page. She began not with buildings, but with names. The older residents who could manage the path would spend their days at the school and sleep either there or in the church hall. Families with small children would take the warmer side of the schoolroom, where the stove wall held heat after the fire was banked. Several adults could sleep in the hall and cross to the school for meals. Households with sufficient private coal would remain at home, but each would be paired with a cottage to check morning and evening. 2 people on the lane behind the post office could not travel farther. One was the laborer still recovering from illness. The other was his sister, whose injured ankle made the church path impossible. Martha offered the parcel room behind her counter. It held shelves, a narrow stove, and enough floor space for 2 mattresses once the empty mail sacks were moved. Lucy updated the map. She rubbed out the long chalk road toward the valley, leaving a pale trace, and strengthened the lines leading inward. The school became the largest square. The church hall received a second chimney. She added 2 short marks behind the post office to represent the mattresses. "Have we forgotten anyone?" Martha asked. They read every name aloud, slowly enough for someone to remember a neighbor, a lodger, or a child who might otherwise be counted twice. Martha checked each against the addresses in her postal book. One cottage beyond the upper well appeared on Reverend Shaw's list, but not Eliza's. Samuel had visited it that morning. Its occupants would remain home and receive coal. A shepherd's hut near the outer field had been empty since before the snow. The final count agreed. Martha drew a line beneath the last name. The movement began before dusk. It did not resemble an evacuation. Doors were closed carefully rather than abandoned. Fires were allowed to settle, ashes were covered, and water pails were emptied where freezing might crack them. Curtains were drawn, keys were labeled and brought to Martha so that someone could check each house without confusion. People crossed the green, carrying ordinary things: pillows tucked beneath arms, folded quilts, kettles, medicine bottles, slippers, books, and small bundles of clothing. Children pulled a sledge loaded with blankets. Samuel carried a wooden chair for Mrs. Wren because she trusted its high back more than the low school benches. At the school, Eliza arranged the long table near the wall to clear space for mattresses. While adults unpacked bedding, she read aloud from the shepherd story used during her first visits. Her calm voice gave the room a rhythm beneath the scraping of chairs and the opening of baskets. Arthur worked near the stove. A pot of oats simmered for the evening, and onions softened in another pan for the following day. He kept the food ledger beside him, but he no longer stood between the shelves and everyone else. When someone offered to peel potatoes, he handed over the knife and moved aside. Reverend Shaw crossed repeatedly between the school and church hall with mattresses, quilts, and candle ends. He tied labels to borrowed bedding so that it could later return to the right house. Samuel spent the fading light repairing what the new arrangement required. He tightened the latch on the school coal box, fitted a loose handle to the church kettle, and shortened a cracked shovel shaft. With the forge banked, he worked beside the school stove, using a hammer and the tools that needed no great heat. Lucy moved between them all, adding changes to her map. When Mrs. Wren chose a chair nearer the window, Lucy shifted the mark representing her bed. When the first family arrived from above the well, she extended their chalk line to the school. By evening, the map no longer showed 30 separate destinations. Most paths gathered beneath 3 roofs. Martha remained at the post office until each name had received a mark. She visited the school, the church hall, and every cottage designated to stay occupied. She did not enter when a lighted window and an answering wave were enough. Where a door remained dark, she knocked. At each place, she checked people against the winter ledger, just as she once checked letters against a dispatch sheet. Her final stop was the parcel room. Reverend Shaw had delivered 2 mattresses, and Eliza had sent clean sheets. Arthur provided a covered bowl of oats. The laborer lay near the stove, while his sister sat beside him with her ankle raised upon a folded mail sack. Their medicine stood safely on the shelf where parcels for Leeds usually waited. Martha hung a curtain across the doorway to give them privacy, then returned to the public counter. There were quiet movements, a spoon against a bowl, and the low exchange of two voices accustomed to speaking only to each other. After closing, Martha carried the winter ledger to the school. Nearly every chair at the long table was occupied. Others rested on mattresses near the walls. Wet stockings hung beside the gloves. Cups passed from hand to hand. Mrs. Wren sat in her own high-backed chair, listening while Lucy read from the blue recipe book as though it contained a story. Martha took her place at the table without waiting for someone to reserve it. Outside, Thornfold was darker than usual. Many cottage windows held no lamps, and most chimneys gave no smoke. Yet the school glowed steadily. The church hall showed a warm bar of light beneath its door, and the post office stove warmed the two sleepers in the parcel room. The snow had first made every house an island. Now the closing of those houses had done the opposite. Under fewer roofs, people shared heat, food, wakeful hours, and sleep. As the evening settled, conversation became softer. Children were tucked beneath unfamiliar quilts. Reverend Shaw lowered the lamps. Arthur covered the breakfast oats. Samuel checked the stove door once more and pronounced it sound. Martha stood at the school window. The falling snow had stopped. Clouds were opening above the hills, and the wind no longer moved loose powder across the green. The paths between the shared rooms remained visible. She returned to the post office and slept in the room above, waking once to add coal to the small stove below. At dawn, a scraping sound reached her through the floorboards. For an instant, she thought of wheels upon the road. Then she recognized the slower rhythm of metal entering snow. When Martha opened the shutter, Samuel and the others were already outside with their shovels. They had begun clearing the road again. The shovels continued through the morning, a patient scrape and lift that traveled slowly away from the village. Martha could not see the workers once they passed the final cottage, but their progress returned to her in messages. Samuel sent the first at 9 o'clock. The path to the ash tree was open. Arthur brought the second before noon. They had reached the place where the hedge dipped beneath the snow. Reverend Shaw returned with the midday party and reported that the stone bridge was visible again. Martha wrote each location in the road ledger she had closed after the second snowfall. Its pages no longer seemed to record failure. They showed that the same work could be resumed, even after the snow had hidden every sign of it. She prepared tea in the stone bottles and arranged dry gloves near the stove. The shared rooms remained in use, though some families returned to their cottages during daylight to air bedding, relight a fire briefly, or check frozen pipes. Each evening, they gathered again at the school and church hall, conserving coal until new supplies could reach them. The sky stayed clear. On the second morning, frost hardened the surface of the drifts. The workers were able to cut snow into blocks and move it beyond the hedges. By afternoon, Samuel reported that they had passed the bridge and entered the open field. Lucy lengthened the chalk road upon the notice board, following his description rather than her own memory. Martha did not yet open the drawer marked "Waiting for Road." She had counted its letters too often to mistake hope for delivery. Instead, she bundled them by destination while they remained inside, valley addresses together, Leeds and Manchester in separate groups, accounts beneath personal letters, Eliza's cream envelope, and Lucy's blue one were placed where they would leave first. The third day began with cloud, but no snow. Martha filled the tea bottles before Samuel asked and wrote the names of both shifts. More people joined the road party now that the paths within Thornfold were firm. Arthur went after preparing the midday meal. 2 farmers brought broad wooden shovels. Eliza remained at the school, while Lucy carried reports between the green and the final cottage. Shortly after midday, a boy arrived at the post office, too breathless to speak. He placed both hands on the counter, waited, then announced that figures could be seen beyond the milepost. They were workers from the valley. Martha went as far as the edge of the green, though the post office sign remained turned to open behind her. From there, she could see only the line of Thornfold men moving down the white road. The meeting itself lay beyond the bend, yet the next messages came quickly. The valley party had cleared upward from the station road. Only one drift remained between the 2 groups, then half a drift, then a narrow opening wide enough for 1 man to pass. Samuel returned near dusk. He carried his shovel, but its blade was clean. "We met at the milepost," he said. The path was not ready for heavy wheels. Its sides needed widening, the bridge required sand, and the steep turn below the ash tree remained slippery. A small mail cart, however, might reach Thornfold the following morning if the frost held. That night, Martha prepared the outgoing bag. She removed every envelope from the waiting drawer and checked each address beneath the lamp. The paper carried traces of the weeks it had spent in Thornfold. A softened corner, a faint scent of coal smoke, a small thumb mark near a seal. None had been opened. All had simply waited while the village learned to send other kinds of messages. Martha tied the letters into bundles and placed them in the leather bag. The drawer remained open and empty. Its label, "Waiting for Road," still faced her from the polished wood. In the morning, she heard the sound before anyone entered. At first it was so faint that it might have been the kettle shifting upon the hob. Then came the measured strike of hooves, the soft grind of iron-rimmed wheels, and a bell moving steadily up the road. Martha stood behind the counter, with one hand resting upon the outgoing bag. People emerged from the school, the church hall, and the cottages along the green. No one hurried into the road. They waited at its edges while a brown horse appeared beyond the bend, followed by a narrow cart carrying the familiar red mail chest. Snow clung to the wheels. The driver's coat was powdered white, and the horse breathed clouds into the cold air. When the cart stopped outside the post office, the bell gave one final note. The driver brought more than letters. There were newspapers tied with string, a parcel of medicines from the valley chemist, 2 small packages, and a canvas pouch of official notices. He explained that a supply cart waited below the bridge until the road could bear its weight. Martha handed him the leather, outgoing bag, Eliza's cream letter, Lucy's blue envelope, Mrs. Alden's message to Manchester, Arthur's supplier order, and Reverend Shaw's request for medicine left Thornfold together. For several moments, Martha watched the bag disappear into the red chest. Then she turned to the incoming mail. The work returned beneath her hands. She cut the string, checked the count, and arranged the letters according to their roots. Yet distribution no longer meant waiting for each recipient to visit the counter. Lucy carried the school letters. Reverend Shaw took those for the cottages near the church. Arthur delivered 2 envelopes along with food. Every outward journey served another purpose. Before noon, the heavier cart arrived. Its wheels moved slowly between the cleared banks, and 2 men walked beside the horse at the steepest places. The load contained coal, flour, lamp oil, salt, and several crates of food. Nothing was abundant, but the supplies were sufficient to relight the forge, refill the school bin, and allow families to return home without fear of empty cupboards. Samuel took the first coal to the forge. Arthur received the flour he had ordered before the first snow. Reverend Shaw carried the medicine parcel to the cottage near the church. Martha marked each delivery in the winter ledger. No one suggested replacing the board with the railway sheet. A request appeared for someone to visit the recovering labourer after he returned home. Samuel added a note about repairing Mrs. Harper's gate. Eliza asked for a carrier to bring the school mattresses back to the rectory. The road had reopened, but the messages within Thornfold continued to move. Lucy arrived near closing time. She stood before the board, reading the completed notices and tracing the thick chalk paths with one finger. Then she carefully loosened the pins holding her map. "I want to see if it is right," she told Martha. She explained that the village could be seen from the slope above the upper well. From there, the roofs, paths, church, and road appeared together. Her chalk drawing might have placed some cottages too close and others too far away. Martha looked at the counter, the sorted letters, and the empty waiting drawer. For the first time in many days, nothing required her immediate attention. She turned the sign to closed, put on her coat, and followed Lucy toward the hill. Lucy led Martha past the upper well and along the path that climbed behind the last row of cottages. The snow there had not been cleared as widely as it had upon the green. They walked one behind the other, Lucy carrying her chalk map beneath her coat, and Martha placing each boot inside the child's prints. The slope rose gently at first, then steepened beside a wall of stone. Thornfold disappeared behind them for several minutes. There were only bare hawthorn branches, the soft compression of snow beneath their feet, and the sound of water moving somewhere below its covering of ice. When they reached the top of the field, Lucy stopped. The village lay beneath them. From the post office window, Martha had always seen Thornfold as separate doors, arranged along familiar routes. From the hill, the roofs appeared close enough to shelter one another. The church tower rose at one side of the green. The school chimney stood opposite it. Between them were Arthur's shop, Samuel's forge, the rectory, the well, and the uneven rows of cottages descending toward the valley. Beyond the final house, the reopened road curved around the ash tree and vanished near the stone bridge. The mail cart had left 2 narrow wheel lines along its center. Beside them, the marks of shovels formed pale walls where the snow had been lifted away. Lucy unfolded her map and held it against the view. Her church was too large. Mrs. Wren's cottage was drawn much farther from the school than it appeared from above, and Arthur's shop did not nearly touch the post office, as the chalk suggested. The curve toward the upper well bent in the wrong direction, The milepost lay beyond the edge of the paper, yet the paths were right. Martha could distinguish the first narrow track from the forge to the post office, remade so many times that the snow there had become firm and grey. She saw the route she and Eliza had followed with the basket of books, branching toward kitchens, where children had copied lessons and adults had quietly revealed what they needed. Another line curved behind Arthur's shop to the kitchen door. From the hill, Martha could not see the widow's shelf or the blue baking tin, but she remembered the smell of cinnamon and the flour upon Lucy's braid. The broadest tracks gathered around the school. They had been made by bowls carried to the long table, blankets drawn on sledges, damp gloves taken to the drying rail, and people coming to sit near the common stove. A second cluster surrounded the church hall. 2 short paths reached the back of the post office, where mattresses had rested among empty mail sacks. Finally, there was the road into the valley. It appeared broader than every other route, yet from above it did not seem more important. It was simply another line joining Thornfold to a place beyond itself. "It isn't very exact," she said. "The distances are not," Martha replied. She looked at the thick places where Lucy had drawn one path meeting another, but the connections are. They remained upon the hillside while the afternoon light softened. Smoke had begun to rise again from the forge, a dark thread at first, and then a steadier plume as Samuel relit the fire with the newly delivered coal. Near the school, 2 figures carried a folded mattress toward the church. Someone emerged from Arthur's shop with a basket and followed the path toward the recovering labourer's cottage. Before the early snow, she had known where everyone lived because an address was required for delivery. She knew the cottages by surname, the farms by gate, and the distant houses by the turns a carrier must take. She had rarely considered the spaces between them, except as distances to be crossed. Now those spaces held evidence. They held the first prints Samuel had made when the road disappeared. They held Eliza's travelling lessons, Lucy's borrowed mittens, coal carried to a low fire, and food moving toward the school. Even where the latest snowfall had covered an older track, the direction remained in Martha's memory. Then Lucy began down the hill, moving quickly where Martha preferred to take shorter steps. At the wall, Lucy waited until Martha reached her. Beyond the upper well, she went ahead alone, her boots leaving a light trail toward the school. Martha remained on the slope a little longer. From there, no cottage seemed entirely separate. A closed door might still conceal loneliness, cold, or a cupboard growing bare. Yet a path could reach it. Someone could carry a question, a bowl, a blanket, a story, or simply the sound of another voice. Martha descended after Lucy. By the time she returned to the post office, the afternoon collection had already gone. She unlocked the door, set the sign to open for the final hour, and placed the new mail into its proper compartments. The empty drawer, marked "Waiting for Road," remained open beneath the counter. Lucy entered while Martha was helping the postman's medicines reach the correct shelf. She stayed only a moment. Martha heard the scratch of a pencil at the public desk and the quiet movement of paper, but when she returned to the counter, Lucy had gone. A white envelope rested beside the brass scales. It had no stamp. The writing on its face leaned unevenly upward. Miss Vale, Post Office, Thornfold. Martha looked toward the letter slot, though no journey beyond the counter was required. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet bearing one sentence. "Thank you for knowing where everyone lives." Martha read it twice. The words were simple enough to have been spoken, yet Lucy had chosen to make them a letter. Martha thought of the child's first blue envelope, with its crooked moon, waiting so long for the road. This second message had travelled only across the room, but it had reached a place few letters ever did. For many years, Martha had believed her duty was to know where each letter belonged. An address was a promise that, if the route remained open and the handwriting could be understood, every message might find the right door. The snow had taught her that knowing where people lived meant something more. It meant knowing how to find them when ordinary routes failed. It meant noticing when a door had not opened, when a chimney had stopped smoking, or when one household had been absent from the long table. It meant remembering that receiving a message was sometimes as important as carrying one. Martha did not place Lucy's letter in the empty drawer. She fixed it to the community board beneath the words "Thornfold Notices." Toward evening, snow began falling again. No one watched the flakes with alarm. Coal now burned at the forge. Flour rested in Arthur's cellar. Medicine had reached the cottage near the church. The road might require clearing again, but the shovels stood repaired and ready. The long tables remained joined in the schoolroom. Eliza had returned some desks to their rows, though she left the tables together beside the stove. Arthur sent a basket of bread to the family behind the upper well. Reverend Shaw carried folded bedding across the green. A woman entered the post office, read the board, and chose a visit she could make before dark. Martha turned the sign to closed and lowered the lamps. Behind the glass, Lucy's letter remained visible above the counter. Outside, the new snow softened the tracks upon the green. The path to the forge grew pale at its edges. The way to the school filled with a fine white dust. Yet before either could vanish, Samuel crossed toward the post office. Lucy ran from the school to Arthur's shop, and another figure carried a covered bowl toward the church. And across the new snow, before the old paths could entirely disappear, the first footsteps had already begun to make them again. And now the lamps of Thornfold are growing dim. The forge fire has been banked for the night. The long tables wait quietly inside the schoolroom, and Lucy's letter remains upon the post office wall. Outside, new snow settles over the village, while gentle footsteps continue from one welcoming door to another. You may let those paths carry on without you now. Allow the village to fade into the distance. Let the last sound soften, the whisper of falling snow, the quiet settling of a fire, and the faint turning of a page somewhere behind a warm window. Nothing more is required of you tonight. The roads will be found again in the morning. For now, you are safe, you are supported, and it is time to rest. Good night.